Patty?
Awesome.
Oh, it's great to have some guests. I think we're good. I love the conversation. As let's know each other, and we're in our final week of our colloquium. So welcome. This is a very special panel that's actually being co-hosted by the Intro to EJ class and also the International Association for the Study of the Commons, and we have some very special guests. We're really going to be hearing today for some leading thinkers and advocates in climate justice, health equity, climate change, and human mobility. So these are really important topics of our time. But before we start with the talk, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Recognizing that Stanford University sits on the ancestral lands of the Muwekma Ohlone people and has played a distinct role in displacing Indigenous peoples. I also want to recognize the continuing leadership of the Muwekma Ohlone and the opportunity to work in solidarity towards reparations and a more just future. And I'll direct you to the muwekma.org website where you can sign in support of the tribe's application for federal recognition if you haven't already. So with that, let me move into the panel that is entitled Climate Migration, Advancing Climate Justice and Health Equity. And I'll start with introductions for our three panelists. We're just thrilled to have Maxine Burkett from Stanford, Jackie Qatalina Shaeffer from Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, and also online joining us, Alma Francis from Taproot Earth. So I'll start with intros and then I'll pass to Professor Burkett, who will kindly moderate for us today. So, and my name is Sybil Diver. I am a co-lead for the Environmental Justice Working Group and also teaching here in the Earth Systems program for Intro to EJ class. So no further ado, Maxine Burkett is a professor of environmental social sciences at Stanford in our School of Sustainability. Maxine's research examines the relationship between environmental change and inequity and its impact on frontline communities. With a background in law and diplomacy, her areas of expertise include climate change, ocean and coastal law, climate-related migration, and human security. Professor Burkett most recently served as a professor of law at the University of Hawaii. She has also held senior roles at the White House and the State Department, for example, as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State of Oceans, Fisheries, and Polar Bears. She oversaw U.S. international policy on oceans, the Arctic, the Antarctic, and marine conservation. She also served as a senior advisor to Special Presidential Envoy for Climate John Kerry on climate-related migration issues, climate security, bilateral relationships with island nations, and Indigenous peoples engagement. And Maxine has also conducted research on climate justice and public health as a visiting professor at Harvard's Medical School's Department of Global Health and School of Medicine. I also want to highlight that Professor Burkett will be teaching an amazing class on climate migration next quarter. So I hope some of you can join this. It's going to be really good. And then second, we're very excited to have presenter Jackie Qatalina Shaeffer, who's presenting as an Inupiaq from Kotzebue, Alaska. Jackie is the Director of Climate Initiatives Program at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. For decades, she has worked across Alaska to holistically infuse Indigenous knowledge into comprehensive planning with energy, housing, water security, sanitation, and climate justice adaptation for rural communities. Her current work includes leading the team at the Center for Climate and Health, and also the team at the Center for Environmental Threatened Communities with the Climate Initiatives Program. She has co-authored 6 regional energy plans for the state of Alaska and the Oscarville Tribal Adaptation Plan in 2019. She was instrumental in the publication of the Unmet Needs Report that you'll hear about for environmentally threatened Alaska Native villages in 2024. And she's co-PI on the Human Wellbeing Team for the study of environmental Arctic change. She's also serving on the National Academy's Board on Environmental Change in Society and a board director for Arctic Encounter Symposium and Rural Community Assistance Corporation. Qatalina also enjoys traditional sewing, art, mentoring youth and young leaders, and passionate about designing passion for modern Inuk. She's also the mother of 6 and grandmother of 10 and currently resides in Palmer, Alaska. And our third panelist for today is Alma Francis. Thank you for joining us, Alma. Alma is a global leader, climate leader, and social justice strategist, now working as senior advisor for the organization Taproot Earth. Their commitment to climate justice stems from lived experience. Alma's own family was displaced by an environmental disaster. And to highlight some of their accomplishments, Alma has previously served as on the World Economic Forum Global Futures Council, presented at expert forums at the World Bank, UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, and UNDP, and others. And their work has appeared in Harvard Environmental Law Review, NPR, and prior to joining Taproot Earth, Alma worked as climate director at the International Refugee Assistance Project, and they continue to work as a fellow at the Sabine Center for Climate Change Law, developing legal solutions to climate displacement. They've also served on the advisory board of the Platform on Disaster Displacement and steering committee of the Climate Migration Network. Sounds cool. Alma received their JD from Yale Law School and a BA, magna cum laude, from Harvard University, and is a member of Phi Beta Kappa and the New York Bar. So with that, let's please welcome the panelists, and I'll pass to the next professor.
Really great to see everybody. It's already familiar faces, as you know, as Sybil mentioned. I'm brand new to campus, but it already feels like home. And thank you to all of you. You've been such wonderful colleagues and friends. I'm going to keep this relatively brief because two of my personal heroes are presenting today, and I want to give maximum time for you to speak to the folks that are here. I also do hope that some of you will join us for the climate we'll teach in the winter quarter, which will really cover local to global issues related to migration, displacement, and relocation. So some of those specifics we can cover in that course, and today I think is going to be a really important introduction to the lived experience of this. Just to kind of situate us even further, I'm personally still raw from my own experience. Jamaica is where I'm from. And as you know, we have experienced very recently a pretty devastating storm, Hurricane Melissa. And of course, the news cycle has moved on, but I know from my mother's experience, from others who are in extended family and friend groups, that this is a very, very long recovery. If you can imagine the United States losing a third of its GDP in 24 hours and having hundreds of thousands, relatively speaking, millions displaced, you can understand the gravity of the situation. My first introduction to the sort of issue of climate migration as this sort of issue that concerns small island states was quite some time ago. It was during the Copenhagen COP meeting. There's a COP meeting happening now in Brazil, but this was the climate conference. And I had the privilege to hear from Ambassador Ronald Jameau, who was of the Seychelles, and he was asking people in a side event. It was kind of a room like this size, and he was speaking about his experience and thinking about leading the country through a lot of uncharted territory. And he was speaking specifically about the loss of land or loss of habitability before complete loss of land for island nations, and asked, what happens to our people? What happens if we become stateless, failed state? And he said, we need legal minds on this. And I was early enough in my career that I said, I have a law degree. This is of concern. How can we sort of do some creative thinking and work to anticipate some of the things he was talking about? Of course, at the time it felt very academic, but we now know some 15, 16 years later that it was far from academic. It's actually present tense. So for myself, I've been working in climate migration and research on this since that time. I have tried to think big, think long-term, and think in different ways about it, but be very specific about how we get to those places. I've written on deterritorialized statehood, what it means to be a nation state, what it means to be in that transitional period. But again, trying to be very specific about it. So when going into government and thinking about how to bridge those big ideas and frankly, unprecedented no analog circumstances and getting specific about it, we really had to be very thoughtful with partners. And I was privileged to be able to do some of that work at the State Department and Pacific Islands and our relationships and how to support policy progression that would track the environmental change that we were seeing. And we did some, I think, good things and at the time. And then I also had an opportunity to engage or re-engage with some pretty phenomenal people like Amma and Jackie, who also are these kinds of thinkers, big ideas, big life-changing ideas, earth-shaking ideas, but very specific about how to get there. And I think that's really key. So I'm, again, really excited to hear from them specific plans about how we meet the change, how we build on blueprints that have been sketched based on those big ideas, based on the horizon. At state, at the White House, I had the privilege of working with Amma on some of these big ideas and migration pathways cross borders. Also at the White House as a co-chair of the National Climate Task Force Subcommittee on Community-Driven Relocation. I had the pleasure of working with Jackie and thinking about how we get to a better place for Native villages in Alaska. And so, again, I am going to yield the floor for the more important, I think, presentations for today, which is Alma and Jackie sharing a bit about their work, what brought them to this work, and their vision for the future as well. So, Alma, please.
Thank you, Professor Burkett. Can you all hear me okay? I can't actually see the room, so okay, I got a thumbs up. Okay. Yes, thank you. Thanks everyone for spending some time with us today, and thanks to Professor Burkett and others at Stanford for the invitation to share some more about climate migration in this important topic. I know we're in a rough political moment that's quite hostile to foreigners, that's quite hostile to immigration, that's quite hostile to even the mention of the word justice. So the fact that we are spending some time talking about environmental and climate justice today, I think, is really critical as part of the resistance to that political stream. And I'm just really grateful to everyone for taking some time out of otherwise busy schedules to learn more about this issue. I'll be talking today about both climate migration and reparations, mostly climate migration from a reparations framing. And I wanted to start by just acknowledging, as Professor Burkett did. Can you all hear me? Okay, I see an adjustment in the room.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, great.
You're good.
Okay, great. I wanted to start with just, acknowledging, as Professor Burkett did, the devastation that Hurricane Melissa just wrought upon Jamaica and other islands in the Caribbean, including Cuba and others. Hurricane Melissa is the strongest storm to have ever hit Jamaica, but it's also an outlier, but also a harbinger of things to come. An outlier in that the way that the storm intensified so quickly was quite different, anomalous, and the attribution scientists have already shown that the ocean and atmospheric conditions at the time were made 6 times more likely to occur by climate change, which is just a really fancy way of saying that climate change made this a monster storm. And I think sometimes we can think of climate change as a future date issue, but I think Hurricane Melissa quite clearly shows, as we know very well in California, that climate is a present day reality where storms are becoming more frequent and intense on their lives, costing people livelihood, and wreaking quite a lot of destruction on a number of levels: economic, social, health, to just name a few. I'm calling in from the island of Dominica, where I'm from, and we just marked the 8th anniversary of Hurricane Maria. Some of you will know Hurricane Maria devastated Dominica in 2017. It was the hurricane that also wiped out Puerto Rico. And for us in Dominica, the small island state in the Caribbean, we lost 90% of buildings. So 90% of homes and other buildings were damaged and destroyed, which is just to say the island was near completely wiped out. And we also lost 20% of our population. So 1/5 of our population migrated after the event, which is definitely what catalyzed me into this work. Because for a small island state to lose 1/5 of the population is quite staggering. I bring all this up to say that sometimes we think of hurricanes or these storms as a moment in time. And I think our news cycle definitely promotes that view. But these storms are actually events that have effects for decades. I still just shopping for groceries here in Dominica will have conversations with people who will mentally still feel in their bodies 8 years later following the storm just moving around the island. There are people who here who couldn't afford to rebuild their homes, so are still living in homes that have temporary roofs or tarps put over, and that's 8 years later. That's the structural effects. It's rolled back decades of development, which will be the same likely for Jamaica as well. Again, I bring this up not just to say, okay, these are not storms that just happen and then they're over. They have effects for years later. And also I think it's important to contextualize climate change, not only in terms of human impact, but also in terms of systemic impact. At Taproot Earth, where I work, and I'll talk more about my work at Taproot Earth shortly, we talk about climate change not in terms of carbon necessarily, and although reducing greenhouse gas emissions is a really important piece of this puzzle, but we make sure to talk about the legacies of racism, the history of colonization, and current systems of extraction that make it so that people are most underinvested in, most under-resourced, Black, brown, poor around the world are bearing the brunt of the climate crisis. I'd like to say personally that climate change exposes the fault lines of injustice, which is a sad reality, but also I think creates this opening for dreaming of a better world. So with that, I'll talk a little bit more about Taproot. I'm gonna share my some slides and you all will tell me if this works. Can you all see that? Can someone give me a big thumbs up so that I know? Yay, okay, great. Thank you. Great. So I work for an organization called Taproot Earth. We are a climate justice organization that's working towards a world where we can live, rest, and thrive in the places that we love. And we center Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty and models of collective governance, democracy, and really solutions that come from communities at the front lines of the climate crisis around the world. One thing that's important to know about Taproot is that we're a sunset organization. We will stop existing after 2030. And originally that 2030 date had come because we had collectively globally set a goal that we needed to have emissions by 2030 in order to avoid more than 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels. Sorry, I know that's a mouthful, but to basically limit the most catastrophic effects of climate change. We know this year that we're likely to hit 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels in the next 5 years or so. But all the same, it's this next, at the end of 2025, these next 4 years are critical in terms of our climate future and our future more broadly as a human species. And we think of this as not just a moment of crisis, but an opening for dreaming and working towards liberation for really all beings. So one of our main initiatives to that end is our global climate reparations work. And I'm going to share a short video that contextualizes that work really well, I think. So I'm going to press play, and again, just give me a thumbs up if you all can hear this. Thank you, great.
Waiting for the beep. Simple words can also be radical. Love, care, honor, repair. Repairing our physical bodies reminds us of the healing powers we possess. Mending relationship is a practice of creation, creating space for compassion, space for grace, for justice. We must root in love, care, and honor as we set our course towards repair. My name is Donald Thompson. I come from Antigua and Barbuda, and with Taproot Earth and Taproot North, my role is senior organizer. The roots of this climate crisis begin with systems rooted in centuries of enslavement and dehumanization, colonialism and genocide, and the targeted extraction of natural resources for the benefit of a few to the detriment of the many. Those systems set the fires that are burning beneath our feet. To put out those flames, we need repair at a global scale. We're in a global climate crisis. Extreme weather, extreme heat, dwindling access to water, and low crop yields, all signs of a changing climate. As the globe experiences the hottest year in recorded history, repairing our Earth for all people is the only way forward. In 2024 alone, storms ravaged communities of the Caribbean and islands in the Pacific. Historic floods devastated communities across Brazil, Tanzania, India, the U.S. Gulf South and Appalachia, killing and displacing thousands. And in Kenya, historic floods preceded historic civic demands for justice and change.
What is the historic opportunity in this new climate reality? Advance repair for real. Define global climate reparations. My name is Jamie Doerr. I'm from Dulac, Louisiana, and I am the Youth Programs Manager at Taproot. What would it look like to repair our relationship with the land? Repair our relationship with one another? Repair our depleted and polluted watersheds? What would it mean to repair the harm caused by extractive fossil fuels? Repair our dependence on exploited labor? Repair our undemocratic economies and failed attempts at democracy?
After seeking permission from indigenous women of East Africa, after building a global facilitation team with fellows from more than 10 nations, after co-creating a process in partnership with communities advancing democracy and justice in the Black diaspora, Taproot Earth convened a historic Global Climate Reparation Governance Assembly in Nairobi, Kenya in August 2024. Participants in the 2024 GCR Governance Assembly took the time to see the vision for a more sustainable world.
I think we saw something much bigger in Nairobi. We saw people really needed to talk about Blackness and indigenous sovereignty and who's gonna pay for this. Not money, but accountability. And how strong can we speak? And how soft do we need to be?
Leaders from the global climate front lines aligned to define repair that leads to the liberation of all people. Gathering more than 200 global South leaders from the front lines of the climate crisis, Taproot Earth facilitated 1 week of powerful discussions, connecting leaders working on water, energy, land, labor, economy, and democracy across the global South. Facilitating across 6 languages, Taproot Earth facilitated political alignment that yielded a powerful statement on global climate repair. A collective statement that broadens the understanding of climate impacts and their connection to historic harms. The solution is meaningful and lasting repair, nothing less. Here's what that looks like.
Global climate reparations is the restoration of healthy and balanced relationships
with all that comprise a shared global ecosystem.
Reparative action begins with those who benefit most
from historic and current systems of oppression.
It requires the abolition of debt,
restitution for injustice,
and the establishment of accountable systems rooted in Black and Indigenous liberation
for all oppressed people and future generations.
The process of building the definition and statement was actually getting people aligned on that vision. It's really about hearing what the room is saying, what people are saying, and then getting clear about what do we need to answer that is common among the room, like where the energy is, where people have hit the notes like over and over again, like this needs to be in this sentence.
to watch people align around that was really amazing. It was more than a definition. It was a process of alignment.
If we're going to do this as a collective effort, we've got to have people understand what we mean, not just read what is on the paper.
That's right.
Our work is just beginning. I'm Clarice Freelou from Grand Bois, Louisiana, and I'm a fellow organizer at Taproot Earth. Choose now and root with us as we address and repair broken global systems.
Choose now to root with us as we create a sustainable future. Choose now to root with us as we liberate the planet and our people. From the US Gulf South to Appalachia and across the global South front lines, we choose now to advance real and lasting repair. We choose now to advance liberation as a necessary element of achieving climate justice.
And by, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, just want to end by just spending a little bit of time on this definition, which it looks like my computer is having trouble pulling up. But the ICJ came out with an advisory opinion that that mentions full reparation, a legal obligation for states who have caused environmental harm to provide full reparation. And there's been a debate about what exactly that means. And for us, this community definition, this frontline definition of climate reparations shares some commonality with the ICJ's opinion. We both agree that repair has to begin with those who have benefited most from oppression. But there's also an important way in which we differ in that for us, reparations is not just about money. It can also include non-monetary repair. And
Well, with your audio. Just.
Alma's no longer on the call. I think that will be best. Yeah. Absolutely.
What's going on?
Is that the view? Do you have speaker notes at all?
No. No problem, my head.
Well, actually, it makes it much easier just to make sure this, just forward and back.
Okay. All right. Everybody has to wake up now. Okay. Mga tika Qatalina, no mechiska Jackie Shaeffer, inibay naronga, anironga kikitagrumi, anayaka kamakiklu, kenyalu, atataga igluklu, ruchuklu, mayaklu. I am Jackie Qatalina Shaeffer. I am Inupiaq from the community of Kikiktagruk, also known as Kotzebue, on the northwest coast of Alaska. And I'm going to share a little bit about who I am and what I do and why it's important to look at local perspective in the state of Alaska, which is what makes the United States an Arctic state. And why that's important globally, because the impacts that happen in the Arctic are a ripple effect to what's happening. So a little bit about me. I was born and raised in Kotzebue, and I am Inupiaq. So the Inupiaq Nunat are across the circumpolar north. We are the stewards of the Arctic polar cap. And so in Alaska, northern Canada, Greenland, and parts of Russia, northern Russia, we are the Inuit Nunat. That is all our Inuit land, and again, stewards of those lands for thousands and thousands of years. Why is that important? Because my family, my ancestry has been on the same geographic space, well, now scientifically proven, for over 600 generations. And so when you could access the same foods, cultural practices, and connection to the land and that space for that long, there is knowledge there that is not knowledge you could find in Western contexts. I want you to remember the image way at the top. You can't really see it, but there was a gravel beach. That was the gravel beach of my hometown and where I grew up.
Oh, sorry, I can just.
Oh, okay.
That far, but closer.
All right. So Kotzebue is all right. So Qatalina is the Inupiaq name for Kotzebue. When the Russians first came, the Russians were first to colonize Alaska. And when they first came to Alaska, of course, whoever landed there got to name their place after themselves. So Kotzebue is named after Otto von Kotzebue, who was with the Russian military. So Qatalina is my home. It's north of Nome, where the arrow is there. It's on a little gravel spit in a very shallow sound. There are no islands in the sound. So what we have are two freshwater rivers that pour into the sound from the mountains. And then that sound pushes against the Chukchi Sea. And so we get this brackish water in this sound that allows this unique ecosystem to thrive. This is my fish camp home that I grew up with for more than half my life. And so we lived half in Kotzebue and half at fish camp. And this is important because your life experience and how you grow up in Alaska really forms how you look at the world. It's a whole different worldview. And I was fortunate enough to grow up that way, as are my children and grandchildren. So this is my thing. We were reindeer herders when I was growing up. So we were able to work with the Sami from Norway and cultivate a system that was sustainable for our people. I also studied abroad in London, studying fashion and design, but really always grounded in my roots as an Inupiaq. Our cultural traditions are very connected to our food cycle, which is a seasonal cycle. Every season we have something to harvest or something to hunt. And so we're still connected to our land base. All these plants, all these pictures are harvested by myself. And so our plants are our food and our medicine. Again, every season has a reason, and we hunt caribou, moose, beaver, we trap, we harvest fish, but within that seasonal cycle, there's always something coming. Therefore, our thought process is always in planning mode. We anticipate the next season and whatever food system that's going to sustain us. I work at the Tribal Alaska, the ANTHC is the acronym, the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, which is a mouthful. And our vision is that Alaska Native people are the healthiest people in the world. This is a really bold vision. And it depends on how you look, what lens you look through, which worldview you look through to really define what health is. Indigenous people who live on the land and harvest 80% of their food from that land and airbase and water, very different lifestyle than somebody who lives in a city. So they're really different worldviews, and unless you physically plant yourself in their world, it's very hard to understand it. And so the definition of health and well-being, very different to our people versus a Western health system. This is from our unmet needs report, which was mentioned earlier. These are just current snapshots. This was published last January, just showing that we live in a very different world in rural Alaska. It doesn't fit a national model, and we get thrown into that national statistic all the time, and it really doesn't apply. We're embedded in the organization under our Division of Environmental Health and Engineering, which to me is really the cusp of how you look at the engineering world through a public health lens. So we engineer things to make life better. In the end, we're all looking for the same goal, which is to make human life better and to make health and wellness the forefront of all our work. Under climate initiatives, I'm just going to share a little bit about this just because it really is driving the work that I do. We are funded through NOAA, and we house two centers, the Center for Climate and Health and the Center for Environmentally Threatened Communities. The Center for Climate and Health really is that thread of connection, connecting plants, animals, and people. Why is that important? Because that's a global impact. We have the largest migratory birds that come up in the spring, and those birds could bring disease that will impact people because we harvest those foods. We harvest the eggs from those birds and we eat them. And therefore, if there's a cross-vector disease from that bird that's come from somewhere else, then we need to understand it in order to protect our people. So that One Health aspect is vitally important. We offer a whole array of ways to look at that. We have the LEO network, which is the Local Environmental Observer Network. It's a free platform where people locally can post pictures, videos, or just environmental things that they see that are unusual. Good example is melting permafrost. It does amazing things to the earth. We have lake drains that are the size of 6 stadiums, and it could drain in 8 hours. So what happens to the water? Where does it go? What's happening underneath? So we have permafrost. How many of you know what permafrost is? Most everybody. Okay, so permafrost is just ice-rich soils that are isolated in the Arctic. And those soils, you have to consider them the cooling system or the refrigerant of the entire planet. As they are disrupted, what do you think happens? It's like your air conditioner breaking down. So it's going to have global impact. So it's really important that we look at it through a public health lens. And through this lens of One Health, really, because our people still subsist off the land, air, and sea, we have communities that have up to 80% of their food resources that are still harvested in nature. That One Health aspect is certainly changing the way we look at our food system. Harvesting plants as food and medicine. This is something that still continues today. This is important because we don't necessarily rely 100% on Western medicine. And so when COVID hit, we were able to isolate communities, and they were able to still thrive in their environment without access to Western systems. And so that is a resilience thread that should be protected and have equal rights as a Western medicine, right? The other center is a Center for Environmentally Threatened Communities. This is a response team. They have 4 major pillars that really work together. First, we have to know what we're dealing with. So we have engineers that are specialty in those things, riverine engineers, erosion engineers, GIS mapping folks. They look at the earth through that lens of engineering, and then they see what the risk is and what threats are. And then they take that information, they create maps and data that then could be used for decision making. So with that, then we have cost estimators, which are RMP engineers. They look at, okay, now we know this is what's happening. What is the infrastructure in place? And how much is it going to cost if we have to move this community completely, or if we're going to mitigate in place and scotch away from danger? Or what if they want to, what if that community chooses to stay there? What is the cost of staying? These are current trends. Everything that happens has a ripple effect. If you look at nature, nature is the great reminder to us all that everything has a connection. And so if you have melting sea ice, and this seems to be the #1 issue right now, is the amount of water we're seeing that's damaging infrastructure. That excess of water is from multiple things. It's not just one thing. So you have increased precipitation, you have melting glaciers, you have melting sea ice at the polar and southern cap. You have a cycle that is accelerating itself, which creates more weather systems, which then creates more water. So everything is interconnected. This report, you could scan the QR code. It'll take you to the full report. Basically, what we wanted to do was bring the reality of local communities to a national and international level. What are those unmet needs, and what are those inequitable systems that continue to create this injustice over and over and over again? I wanted to share a little bit with the reality of what's currently happening. We had never experienced typhoons in Alaska. In 2022, we had an ex-typhoon Merbach. It basically hopscotched over the Aleutian chain and hit a pocket of warm water. That pocket of warm water reaccelerated the storm. So we're starting to see a similarity to the previous speaker, right? So it reaccelerated a storm and hit the coast almost to the winds of a typhoon again. That was 3 years ago. The inequity and injustice is the FEMA funding that got to the state has never reached the communities for recovery of that storm. So it takes years for the system to actually work. This ex-typhoon didn't stop. It just continued up through Alaska, through the Bering Sea, and up to the coast. It did unusual things that even forecasters had never seen before. The storm switched, and then it hit harder. So what it did is it propelled the water inland, and then it sucked it back out. And with it, it took entire villages, including homes, with people in them. And this is what it left. The same destruction you see in Jamaica, same destruction you see in Dominican Republic. It's like everything got tossed in a washing machine and spit back into the ground. How do you recover from this? Unfortunately, this happened in September, and it's now frozen ice. It's winter in Alaska. So there's no even beginning the recovery process. Nature just continues its cycle. These are just pictures of one of the most devastated communities. When you have energy infrastructure that is broken like matchsticks, it's very difficult, one, to repair it because you have to start from scratch. You have to first clean everything up, and then you have to re-engineer and reconstruct that energy system. This can't be fixed because it can't even be cleaned up until next spring. So that means no one could live in that community until they have power. Certain buildings, like the school, which is usually elevated, it's the emergency evacuation center. It acted as a barrier, so things just floated and stacked up against it. There was one, I don't think I have a picture of it, but what happened is they had to take all these people, thousands of people, and displace them. But there's no other close village that has accommodation for them. So most of them got airlifted by the National Guard to Anchorage. Some of them 700 miles away from home. This is what it looked like. But these are the same people who thrive in that environment. And this is why it's important to remember this, and then you connect it to people. So the whole point when we originally started this is what we all work towards, creating a better life for humans. And the only way we can do that is to really understand the realities of what's happening across the globe. So you've heard from 2 different parts of the world. And there are similarities and connectors because we're in an Earth system that works together. They're not separate. So everything that happens locally impacts globally. And so understanding that this is a large interconnected system, vitally important when you look at climate justice. So our goal is to have healthy, thriving communities, no matter where we are on the planet, and that we lift them up and support them so that they can make those informed decisions with the right tools, products, and information, then continue to thrive the way they choose. So this is just one of my elder mentors that really resonates. We all get to choose. We have the opportunity to heal, but we individually get to choose and make a difference in the world. And how we do that is in every one of us. So, yeah.
Yeah, please do, Jen. What I'm hoping to do now is just I was going to ask a couple of questions of our speakers and then open it up for all of you. I'm sure you have a number of questions. Maybe I'll go first with you, Jackie, because as we figure out where Amma is in the ether. But yeah, we're seeing these unprecedented storms, and my exposure and introduction to all the incredible work that ANTHC is doing was through your unmet needs report. And a lot of that is thinking about some of the failures or some of the hurdles, and in some cases failures, in terms of really servicing communities as they're really having to address and plan for relocation. And then we're seeing that as these long-term planning processes are going, they have these acute events. How are you thinking about this cascading event and preparing for both the longer term movement and these kinds of acute events at the same time?
Yeah, so when Merbok hit in 2022, it was, an eye opener. We don't get typhoons in Alaska. Well, they call them ex-typhoons, but really the damage they do looks similar to a typhoon or a hurricane. And so I grew up in Alaska. When we have 100-mile-an-hour winds, they just call it a wind warning. They say it's high winds today. The kids have the option to go to school. And I remember making the decision not to let my little kindergartner go to school because I didn't think I could hang on to her in 100-mile-an-hour winds. So when we see these storms, with this most current one, it really it recharted the urgency of our work. We knew it was urgent work. But what we're seeing is an acceleration that it's spinning out of control. So our response has to be, one, it has to be culturally appropriate because we serve our tribes. We have 229 tribes in Alaska. And how we serve them is important because they have been there for thousands and thousands of years. So in order to be just and equitable, we have to allow them access to that if that's what they choose. And so this is where then when you have laws in place that prohibit you from living on that land cycle of the food system. So what we have is this system that we migrated with our food just 100 years ago. We were nomadic. And in 100 years, now we're isolated to community by force, so forced location. And now we're having forced relocation because nature isn't giving us a choice. And so it really isn't about, there's no justice in any of it yet, right? So how do we look to the future and look at maybe 10 years or 20 years from now, what those children, the future leaders, what decisions they're going to have to make. So it really is. When you look at less than a decade ago, the Denali Commission said there were 33 environmentally threatened communities. It was 7 years ago that we stood up the environmentally threatened communities program because there were 33. Now we're up to 150. So in less than a decade, we are accelerating much faster than people realize. And I think because our populations are small and we're not out in the world, nobody understands why that's so important, but really what's happening in the Arctic is gonna have this ripple effect across the globe. Those storms are gonna intensify and they're gonna come more frequently.
Maybe I could just quickly piggyback then. A lot of what you're describing as well are increased vulnerabilities from Western introduced structure. Can you describe a little bit more about what that looks like and how you're thinking about, say, when you go back to the community that's just been displaced, how you rethink, what are some of the initial questions you'd ask and ponder, and how would, through the lens of the ancestors, that rebuild look? Again, understanding that some of the vulnerabilities are Western introduced.
Well, I'm kind of optimistic. So I look at it as an opportunity to really evolve as human beings. Because if we're going to have excess water across the globe or in spaces that humans live, everyone's going to have to think about this. And so if we have excess water, we have to re-engineer. You can't engineer for land-based systems. So energy systems, water and sanitation systems, housing systems, even road systems. There are communities in the Pacific that were water communities. We have to learn from each other and understand that we could engineer, but we could evolve together. And so when I look at those communities, I look at everything in that pile and that picture was from a Western construct, a Western system of some kind. The only thing that really wasn't was the foods that floated away in Western freezers. So they lost their foods that they collected for 3 or 4 seasons, right? They collect the food all early spring, summer, late summer, fall, and then they store it for the winter. All that food was gone. So now they have to eat Western food for a whole winter because there's no food. Fortunately, the value system in Alaska is everybody sharing their traditional foods. And I have tons of stories that are inspirational, but when I look at those communities, I really look at that infrastructure and I go, now this is all Western infrastructure. If we as human beings are going to evolve, we have to think differently. We have to be curious and we have to look beyond stick house, right?
I would love to first just give you an opportunity to close. We did hear most of your presentation, but perhaps if you can share a little bit more about how Taproot Earth is serving as a vessel for some of the work that you had been doing, and any lessons learned as we think about repair after these pretty acute events.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor Burkett. And I wish more than ever now that I was in the room with you all. The limits of technology are very, very apparent to me at this moment. But thanks for the patience and for the opportunity to just close. So Taproot Earth has been doing the work of convening frontline organizations to put together this definition of global climate reparations. And the next stage of this is mobilizing communities to establish an ecosystem for climate reparations finance. So one of the goals is to collaborate with others to stand up a global climate reparations fund in the coming years. And the fund, part of the work is to define the fund. Again, is not just about money, but making space for other sorts of repair as well, whether that's migration pathways or improved relationships, so noting that as well. And I sort of, actually, maybe I'll just pause there, actually. Yeah, I'll just pause there.
Well, I'm going to urge you to maybe go a little farther, actually. But very specifically, you mentioned at the outset, I mean, you're 8 years from a pretty disruptive event, a completely disruptive event for Dominica. And I wonder if you have any advice on what the road ahead looks like, some of the things to perhaps avoid, but some of the opportunities in the midst of displacement for renewal.
Yeah. I think one of the, thanks for that, Maxine. I think just walking around and being here, there's a really strong case for regionalism I think for small islands, it's very clear that we have strong social networks. Some of I think our greatest wealth is in how much we care for each other and how willing people are able or how willing people are to help each other. But as small economies and small populations, we're really incredibly vulnerable to climate disasters and have a hard time recovering. And so one of the things that's hopeful to me is, and I was going to talk about this a little bit later, but one of the things that's most hopeful to me is that some of the islands in the Caribbean community, CARICOM, decided to implement entire free movement in the last couple of months. It's 4 islands: Barbados, Dominica, Belize, and St. Vincent, Belize not being technically an island, but 4 Caribbean nations. And this is a framework which allows any national of those countries to live and work, access healthcare and education in any other place. And I think there's this understanding in the Caribbean that's growing that we need to move together. And another way that's coming out is in this call across the Caribbean for reparations. So even after the wake of Hurricane Melissa, members of the Jamaican government, Jamaicans who are not in government, have been really pushing this argument that this is an example of why we need reparations, that the extraction of African labor fueled the Industrial Revolution, which fueled the fossil fuel industry, which fueled our climate crisis, which is now leading to these storms. And as islands, we just don't have the resources to recover, even when we're insured. So we need debt abolition, we need reparations. I think Caribbean islands are really working together to make these calls as a group, which I think is really important.
Thank you, Alma. I would say, obviously, we're in a moment of backsliding. It's difficult to use some of the words that we've used even today. And I want to acknowledge that, but also, well, first ask, where do you think, what do you think is driving that shift? I have some thoughts too, and I'm happy to join the conversation. What do you think is driving that shift? And also, what are some of the bright spots you're seeing? What some of the spaces of hope? And Alma, I'll let you continue since we have excellent connection right now, and I don't want to risk losing it. And then please, Jackie, after.
Yeah, I think this is what you're alluding to, Maxine, but it almost seems like we're living in split realities where on the one hand, sort of regressive views are becoming stronger. And I think on the other hand, progressive and radical views are also being spoken more loudly and more firmly. To me, and you would know this, you've been working on reparations for so long now. The fact that the International Court of Justice would use the word reparation in an advisory opinion is kind of mind-blowing to me. And so on the one hand, I think we have this moment where I think on both sides, people feel that this is a critical turning point, for better or for worse. And I think for the work that we do at Taproot, or through people who care about environmental and climate justice, there's a recognition that this is a moment to seize and to really push for the boldest visions that we have for a better future.
Yeah, and I would say it offers us an opportunity to connect as Indigenous people across the globe because the impacts are similar. Most Indigenous people are rooted in culture and values that connect them to their place. And that in itself allows a connection. So I think in this moment of pause, or whatever you want to call it, I think it's a good time to reflect, because the entire planet can learn from those value systems and learn from those traditional practices that have been in place for thousands of years. And so how do we make sure that we capture that in this moment of kind of this dual reality?
I love that notion of a moment of pause, because there's sort of, it feels like there may be stasis and regression, but there's also reflection and stability in those moments as well. So thank you for that. I don't want to be selfish and just ask my questions of the two of you. I want to open this up and hear what all of you are thinking, what your questions may be for our speakers. Any other reflections? Hi.
Hello. My name is Betty, and I'm a sophomore majoring in English and Earth Systems. Thank you so much for your talk. And I wanted to connect to something that Jackie mentioned about like Indigenous peoples connecting with each other. Because I feel like there are like Indigenous peoples all around the world, and some of which are living in more authoritarian governments. For example, I'm from China, and there's like a lot of ethnic minorities in China who I guess don't often have a voice at those like international tables. So how would you say in those cases you would think about how to like connect these groups together?
Yeah, it is a good question. I feel so isolated in the Arctic. But I do some work in the UN space, and the Indigenous Peoples platform is a good place for that. But that was my question at COP29 was, what about those minorities that have no voice in this space? And it really takes, grassroots organization champions to kind of pop out, right? So guess I would encourage you to really look at that. I mean, it doesn't have to be, saw Inuit Nunat as across the Central North. We rely a lot on our Greenlandic Inuit because they have a voice at the international level. And they have a loud voice. And so we kind of, grab onto their coattails and they become we become part of their voice. I think that for small Indigenous communities, especially that are, being impacted by environmental change, it's going to take that type of unity at that grassroots level. And then to join organizations like Amazon organization where they banded islands together. Like it takes somebody to say, okay, we need to do something different and we need to unify. And I think that that's probably the biggest message.
Thank you.
Alex.
Jackie and Professor Burkett, thank you for this conversation. One of the things I've been thinking about is how you see the balance of translating lessons learned and solutions being implemented that are working in some places with the real like place-based needs of others. I don't know, how do you apply those lessons learned? What are some of the challenges? Some of the opportunities maybe in that way?
Yeah, it's so funny. I'm obviously a curious person. And I remember landing over a decade ago in a village and it was too salt water. And I said to the engineer that I hope you're starting to think about engineering in water world. Well, that was over a decade ago. And so we have to start changing. Even our educational systems are very siloed. You learn one sector and you go into that sector until you retire from that sector. And what we need is people who kind of blow those boundaries down together. So you have the engineer and the artist and the healthcare professional and the psychologist, and you have them all in the same space saying, how do we look at this through a different lens to create different outcomes that will make healthier people, right? And so I think that is an opportunity. Because to me, it's easier to scale up than it is to scale down, but our systems in place start with this level. And then they try to scale down, and it usually doesn't apply to those small, voiceless tribal communities across the globe. It usually applies to those who have money or access to money, right? So I think that it's important to start looking at it through a different lens and having those conversations and going into spaces that are maybe uncomfortable and just thinking differently.
Yeah, hi, I'm Miriam. Thank you so much for your time. I had a question for Jackie and also maybe for Amma about deciding between protection in place from climate change or adapting in place to climate change versus deciding when it's necessary to retreat or like have managed retreat or migration. So I was curious, like for Jackie, with the communities that you work with, how communities think about when it's appropriate to adapt in place versus pursue managed retreat, and also maybe for Amma about in terms of global climate reparations, whether you have like thoughts on that being used to help communities adapt in place, or if reparations also means creating pathways for people to migrate out of climate stressed areas.
Great question.
And I think you're gonna have two different answers,
absolutely.
right? So again, the Arctic, people have been there for thousands of years. That is something that we struggle with because they are connected to the land. That their languages are based off that geographic space. Their science and their ingenuity is based on where they live. And so it's really difficult to think that you could live somewhere else. Mind you, we're nomadic, but nomadic within a space, right? And not a very large space, but Alaska currently is 65% owned by the US government and 25% owned by the state of Alaska, which is another Western governmental system. So when it gets to the indigenous population, what we have is no pleasure of movement because it's controlled by someone else. We don't have the privilege of time. And so our decisions are, especially after this last storm, we're having to look through a different lens. And what we're hearing across the state is those people don't want to go anywhere else. They've been there for thousands and thousands of years. They want to be within that land base. And unfortunately, most of the land that they would have migrated on is federal land. And even though the tribes have this federal to federal relationship, it's not a good relationship. And therefore, I'm going to use one example in the relocation of Utah. It took 8 years for them to negotiate with the US government and an act of Congress to acquire the land to save their people. They were able to move, but from where they moved from, that old village, most of it washed away into the river and the sea without any environmental cleanup. So the systems in place are very difficult to maneuver through. So the unmet needs report calls out the agencies and those challenges and barriers that prohibit us from making informed decisions. And so the mitigate in place or protect in place, that is a tough one for Alaskan natives because I can't imagine not having access to my traditional foods. It's a thought process that we don't understand.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. That last thing you said, that you can imagine having access to your traditional foods just really resonated with me. And it's there are some communities that have, and peoples that have such a strong connection to land and the places that they've been for generations. And that is absolutely important to protect. I think for us, it's a both and it's to maximizing choice as much as possible for people to have the ability to stay if that's what's best for them and their communities, or to have the option to move if that's what's best for them and their communities. So just being able to support people's agency to the greatest extent possible, I think, is the at least the value behind any of these policies. And so in a reparatory framework, I think, yes, that means protecting people's right to stay in place, but also recognizing that in some cases, migration can be very, well, I was going to say natural. In these conditions, they're not necessarily natural, but necessary in a way that actually does improve people's lives and where they do actually want to move. And a reparatory frame, I think, recognizes that as well. I think the last thing I just want to say on this is that sometimes I think there's a hard line that's drawn between people staying or people leaving. And I just also want to remember seasonal migration and just the fact that people can leave a place and come back to a place and leave again and come back. And that exchange can be quite important, especially for countries and communities that have a vibrant diaspora, and where that exchange is important and critical part of adapting to the climate crisis as well.
I might just piggyback on that, Aman. I think you would understand my drift a little bit in the sense that one of my professors in law school described a legal feedback mechanism, which was to say that in the climate science, there's positive feedback loops, and there's a feedback loop, with respect to albedo and sea ice loss and all of those sorts of things. And he was sort of describing that, in fact, the law is also creating a feedback mechanism that can either aggravate or ease the ability to adapt to climate change or your experience of climate change. And so when we think about what you're describing, and frankly, what I understand to be sort of more traditional relationships, it's very fluid, and there is a lot of movement, there is a lot of migration and context, but we have jurisdictional lines that make that more difficult, even at the subnational level. We certainly know it at the international level because the movement is, mediated by visas and hard borders, even if invisible, but hardened in some cases, and it becomes more challenging. And so just wanting to piggyback on what both of you are describing, which is that agency sometimes even meets resistance in places you may not expect, making that experience of climate change more challenging. I saw a hand, and then, okay, so I'm going to ask you another question later, but go ahead, please.
My name is Brittany. Thank you all so much for talking to us today. I guess my question is related to her, because I am doing this Hurricane Doerr all the way back and how devastating that was. And I guess my question more relates to a path for resilience and climate reparations that allows island nations like Jamaica to their autonomy. Because I feel like when discussion with like payback is always brought up, it also aligns with indebtedness. And I'm wondering how like these countries can still remain their sovereignty when faced with countries who are already abstinent to giving aid and to allow migration as a chance to move forward to recover.
Did you hear that?
I did not. I could hear that it was a great question, but none of the specifics of the question.
Yeah, so if I can summarize and correct me.
Chat, sorry.
Oh, you added it to the chat?
I did.
Okay.
Well, the question is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what would be a path for resilience and reparations that allow island nations like Jamaica to retain their autonomy and sovereignty?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I had mentioned that Jamaica is partly insured through a catastrophe bond, and not to get too technical, but after Hurricane Melissa was paid out $150 million, and that'll go some way in supporting recovery, but is not going to cover obviously the $6 billion to $7 billion in losses that the country faces, which is just to say that you're pointing to an important problem, which is that island nations are bearing most of the cost of recovering from disasters, and huge costs that set them back again decades in terms of how much debt they owe, which just trickles down to everyday people in really staggering ways. And so part of, I think, sovereignty is understanding those economic structures and shifting them. So debt abolition is a really important call, for example. But I also think there's sort of a shift in geopolitical power that also helps smaller islands be able to be at the table in ways that are meaningful. So I had mentioned that Tuvalu and Australia had entered into a bilateral agreement where Australia agreed to give visas to people from Tuvalu given the climate crisis. But in exchange for those visas, Tuvalu had to agree to not enter into any security or defense-related agreements without Australia's permission, essentially. In a way, signing away their control over their national security agenda. And so in these very minute ways, this is not a legal question of sovereignty, but in many ways, the climate crisis constrains countries' abilities to be fully independent, to make choices about their national policies, like national security. And so again, that's why I think a reparatory framework is really important, because it creates this context where we're not asking for charity with visas, for example. We're asking for repayment or openings based on what's owed, based on harm done. It's a big question, and yeah, I appreciate it. I'm curious if Jackie has anything to add.
Well, I was definitely going to move to you, Jackie, because there's a sovereignty question for you as well. I mean, right, it may be subnational, so there are different, players and actors involved. But in terms of Alaska Native Villages sovereignty, decision making, thoughts.
Well, and I think what you basically said, I mean, the geopolitics really is the deal breaker, right? Because they put small tribal communities in situations where they're so pressured that they'll accept injustice in order to survive. And it made me think of one of our tribal leaders who she said at the UN that we should not be writing grants to save our people. And then the question to her was, they were talking about endangered species. And she said, it's not the polar bear, it's not the wolf. The next endangered species is Inuit. So when you think about that and you think about it in the context of sovereignty, colonization plays a huge role in all of this, right? And so I think about, we call the negative impacts of environmental change across the globe a positive feedback, which doesn't make sense. So it causes confusion within the thought process itself. So I think that we have to be aware when we talk about sovereignty to make sure that we recognize all these other factors, geopolitical, colonization. I feel like in America, we were the last colonized because it was hardest to get to us, right? So like I was the first to graduate from my high school in my hometown. My aunts, uncles, parents all went to boarding school. So if you know the history of boarding school in America, that was them. And so we recognize this, but I think that when you look at what's happened even in 100 years, we use it as a positive, then we can look at ways to respond differently, right? And look at it not across the race spectrum, but just the reality that colonization of any people, because white people colonize white people too. So it's not like there was just colonization across the globe. But I think about that and I think about language. Right? When you don't speak your indigenous language, you lose something. And your brain wires the way you process information differently if you only speak English. And I say this because I'm relearning my language, and it's really difficult as an adult. As a child, I had no issue, but something happened in that lifespan that closed parts of my brain. And so you think about that, that's a sovereignty issue, right? That's an injustice to a people or to individuals that then has different outcomes. So when I make a decision as a leader, and I can't access that ancestral knowledge like this because I don't have language piece, the outcome is going to be a very English-centric outcome. So we have to recognize that as well, because I think as we all are speaking English, we have to recognize that that was a big part of how people thought differently. And we don't want to lose that in humanity if we want to evolve.
We do have a question from the chat that I'm going to ask you first, Jackie, and Alma on this. A freelance journalist and environmental activist who's really curious about the role of art and storytelling in reparation frameworks and in supporting community resilience. What are the most effective ways to elevate these stories to the general public without exploiting the communities?
It really is interesting because you have a sense of responsibility for part of a tribe. That's one of our values is responsibility to tribe. So when I come and share a story of New Talk or whatever, I have to have permission from them to share that story in any platform. And so I think storytelling is powerful. What we saw in Alaska when we had everyone focus on a few communities in Alaska is that we had community fatigue. And so part of our technical assistance is buffering those communities from that fatigue. And so but I think it's really important to gain permission and to make sure that you articulate it the way they want it articulated. Do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Jackie, to speak to consent and permission. I think that's a really important part. And just adding to that, I think the other piece that's important is bringing stories back to communities. So it's not just elevating stories, but once they're shared, bringing stories back. What was the information that was shared? If a report was written or a piece of art was made, making sure that the community that contributed to that has an opportunity to see it and contribute as well, I think is a really important part of how we work at Taproot Earth.
That's the co-evolution that I hear you describing, is what Jackie and I've talked about, and you've shared with everyone else. And so, in some respects, I hope that this was a conversation that really weaved together some of these themes and reinforced how interconnected we are globally, because certainly what's happening in the Arctic, happening in the islands, share a lot of physical, geopolitical, and really cultural interconnection. So my deep gratitude to you, Alma from Dominica, joining us, Dominica, excuse me, and Jackie, of course, traveling to us here at Stanford.
I know that you can present, but I was funny to say,
Thank you.
Thank you to Jackie for